You're out on a peaceful fishing trip with your buddies. No phone, no stress, just taking a break from life. Then suddenly, the Coast Guard shows up, guns drawn, telling you you've been kidnapped, and your wife's at home freaking out, talking to a ransom caller. Turns out, it's all because of your own twin brother, who's hiding secrets that could ruin your life. But it gets worse. When I finally get back home, the truth that unravels is something I never saw coming. This is my story. In the small town of Willow Creek, everyone knew each other. Friends, family, loyalty. It all ran thick like sap-down old trees. For the longest time, I thought that bond was unbreakable, especially with my twin brother, Rick. We grew up side by side, same face, same blood. But over time, it became painfully clear. You can look alike and still be worlds apart. Rick was the guy everyone liked. He could charm anyone, sell anything. And while he worked his way up in sales, selling insurance, and charming every client that walked through his door, I stayed behind, elbow deep in grease at my dad's auto repair shop. I preferred it that way. Cars don't talk back. They don't make promises they can't keep. And honestly, I thought I had it good. I married Liz, a hardworking woman who ran her own little real estate agency. We weren't fancy, but we were solid. Or at least that's what I thought. Then, last October, things started to feel off. Liz would zone out during dinner, answering questions with half smiles and vague nods. My gut told me something wasn't right, but whenever I asked, she'd brush me off. Just work stress, she'd say, putting on a strained smile. Meanwhile, Rick and I hardly spoke anymore. We'd gone from best friends to awkward strangers. Whenever I tried to catch up with him, he'd give short answers, ducking out of conversations. I figured he was busy living his flashy life while I toiled away at the shop. But I could never have guessed how much he'd actually drifted, or what he was hiding. Finally, fall rolled around, and I took off for my annual fishing trip with my two best friends, Adam and Mike. Every year we'd head up to Pine Lake, where there was no cell signal, no distractions, just a beat-up cabin, a few rods, and a whole lot of cheap beer. This was our chance to unwind, and we made it a point to leave our phones behind. It was supposed to be a weekend of laughter, fishing, and a break from everything else. But this year it nearly cost me my life. On the second day, just as we were about to head back from a long afternoon on the water, a speedboat approached us fast. We thought maybe it was some local kids messing around. But then I saw the uniforms. Coast Guard officers were armed and dead serious, heading straight for us. "Is one of you named Matt Jenkins?" One of the officers barked, his eyes fixed on me. I blinked, feeling every muscle tense up. Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" The officer's voice was cold, professional. "We received a report that you've been abducted. Your wife got a ransom demand for $250,000. She thought you were in serious danger." I laughed, half expecting someone to yell, "Gotcha!" But the officer's expressions didn't change. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I'm not kidnapped. I'm right here with my buddies on our fishing trip. No phones, no distractions. Just us and the lake." They didn't look amused. The officers boarded our boat, checked every corner, then asked us to show our IDs. I tried to joke about it, but the cold stares and weapons didn't exactly lighten the mood. After what felt like forever, they finally seemed convinced that I wasn't in immediate danger. But one officer told me I'd need to return to shore with them to clear things up. Adam and Mike looked as stunned as I felt. I told them to stay and keep fishing while I went back with the Coast Guard. They nodded, but I could see the unease on their faces as I boarded their boat. I had no idea what I was walking into, but a knot of dread was already twisting in my gut. We reached the dock, and waiting for me was a swarm of police, including a detective who introduced himself as Detective Grant. As I climbed out of the boat, I spotted Liz in the crowd, her face pale and tear-streaked. The moment she saw me, she ran over, wrapping her arms around me like she'd just seen a ghost. "Oh my God, Matt," I thought. Her voice broke, and I could feel her shaking. "I'm fine," I told her, confused and irritated. "But what the hell is going on?" Detective Grant stepped forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Jenkins, Your wife received a call this morning. The caller claimed they had kidnapped you and demanded a ransom of $250,000. They gave her 24 hours to deliver it, warning her not to call the police. I stared at him, speechless. Felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie. Ransom? For me? I laughed bitterly. Look, I work in an auto shop. I'm not exactly worth a fortune. Who would go through the trouble to pull something like this? Detective Grant's face remained stern. We take threats like this seriously, Mr. Jenkins. It's a matter of life and death. They promised to call back at 3 p.m. with further instructions, and we've set up a trace on the line to track them down. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. But I was on a fishing trip. I wasn't kidnapped. Why would someone? I trailed off, feeling a chill run down my spine as I turned to Liz. Did you call the police right away? She bit her lip, nodding slowly. I didn't know what else to do, Matt. I thought they'd really taken you. Detective Grant nodded approvingly. Your wife made the right call. We're working on tracking the number now. It's almost 3 p.m., so we need to be ready for when they call. As the clock ticked toward 3, we sat in tense silence, all of us on edge. Finally, Liz's phone buzzed, and she answered, her voice shaking as she spoke to the disguised voice on the other end. Is the money ready? The voice asked coldly. Liz swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. I haven't gathered it all yet. I need a little more time. You were warned, the voice snapped. I told you not to involve anyone else, but you brought in the police. We know. Now, the price is $300,000. And if we don't get it, he's dead by 9 a.m. tomorrow. The call ended abruptly, leaving the room thick with dread. Liz looked at me, her face ashen, and then something seemed to break in her. Her shoulders slumped, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. Detective Grant noticed and shot her a sharp look. Mrs. Jenkins, is there something you haven't told us? Liz took a shaky breath, looking anywhere but at me. There's something I need to confess. I felt my stomach drop as she finally turned to me, guilt written all over her face. Matt, I've been seeing Rick, your brother. We've been involved for a few months now. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For months, I'd been watching Liz drift away, and now I knew why. The betrayal was a bitter knife twisting deep. And worse, the brother I thought I knew had been sneaking behind my back this whole time. Detective Grant held up a hand, urging calm. Mr. Jenkins, I know this is hard, but right now, we need to focus on getting your brother back safely. I clenched my fists, barely containing my anger. Let him rot, I muttered. He brought this on himself. Liz's eyes filled with tears. Matt, please, I know what I did was unforgivable, but Rick, he's still your brother. You can't just leave him to die. I looked away, rage boiling in me, but Detective Grant stepped closer. Mr. Jenkins, regardless of what's happened, there's a life on the line. Let's get him back. Then you can deal with everything else. After a tense pause, I finally gave a nod, teeth gritted. Fine. What's the plan? Detective Grant laid it out. The police would try to locate Rick's kidnappers, stall them as long as possible, and keep Liz's phone monitored. Meanwhile, they'd set up officers near my house, ready for any surprises. I sat in silence, watching the clock, feeling fury simmer in me. How could my own brother and my wife do this to me? The betrayal felt deeper than any threat a stranger could ever make. Now I just had to survive the night and see if this nightmare would finally end. The tension was suffocating as I sat there in the living room, waiting. Detective Grant's plan seemed solid, but my mind was barely holding on. Rick and Liz. Just the thought of them together felt like acid in my veins. My own brother and my wife sneaking around behind my back. And now I was supposed to care about saving his life? Still, part of me couldn't shake the image of Rick in some rundown warehouse, hurt or worse, all because of this mess. As angry as I was, the idea of leaving him to die gnawed at me. But when I glanced over at Liz, I felt that anger surge all over again. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and every now and then, she'd look at me like she was about to say something, but I turned away every time. I couldn't stand to hear another word from her. It was past midnight, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the clock ticking away the seconds. Detective Grant stepped into the room, phone in hand, his face tense. He had been coordinating with his team, who were combing through any and all locations that might lead them to Rick's kidnappers. Finally, he hung up and looked at us, his expression grim. "We've managed to narrow down the location to an industrial district on the outskirts of town," he said. "But we're going to need a little more time to pinpoint it exactly. Hopefully, they'll call again, and we can keep them talking long enough to trace it." "What if they don't?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Grant didn't flinch. "If they don't, we'll have to move in as soon as we have a lead. But Mr. Jenkins, we're doing everything we can to avoid that scenario. The less risk, the better." Risk. The word echoed in my mind. If things went south, Rick might not make it out. As much as I wanted to stay angry, that thought gnawed at me. I clenched my fists, trying to keep the whirlwind of emotions in check. Then, suddenly, Liz's phone rang again, piercing the silence. Every officer in the room went tense. She looked at me, terrified, before swiping to answer. "Hello." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is the money ready?" The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical, likely run through some kind of distortion software. But there was no mistaking the menace in it. Liz's eyes flicked to Detective Grant, who nodded for her to play along. I have most of it," she stammered. "But it's been hard to get all the cash together so fast. Please, I just need a little more time." The voice on the other end let out a cold laugh. "Time? You think this is a negotiation?" There was a pause, then a faint sound of movement. I could hear muffled sounds, like someone struggling. Then I heard it. Rick's voice, desperate and weak. "Please, please, don't do this. There was a loud thud, and Rick's voice cut off. My stomach dropped as the voice on the phone spoke again, icily calm. "This is what happens when you don't listen. Now, you have until 6 a.m. If we don't get the money by then, he dies. And we'll know if you call the police again." The line went dead, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Liz's face was pale as she looked at Detective Grant. Fear etched into every line. What do we do now?" Grant clenched his jaw, his gaze steely. "We'll stick to the plan. We're closing in on them. We just need more time." He turned to one of his team members. "Get the tracker team ready. We may need to move in fast." I felt sick to my stomach, torn between fury and worry. My mind flashed to the last time I'd seen Rick, months ago, at a family barbecue where we barely spoke. Now he was somewhere out there with his life hanging by a thread. Liz looked at me, guilt and desperation in her eyes. "Matt, please. I know I hurt you, but Rick, he's still your brother. We can't just let him." "Don't you dare," I snapped, the anger surging up like wildfire. "You don't get to play the family card now. You lost that right the second you went behind my back with him." She flinched, looking down, but didn't argue. Detective Grant shot us both a warning look. "Keep it together. Every minute counts, and we can't afford to let emotions get in the way. Right now, saving your brother's life is the priority." I nodded, biting down my anger, though it burned hotter than ever. "Fine," I muttered. "But the second this is over." Detective Grant didn't let me finish. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Right now, we need to focus." Time dragged on, the minutes ticking by painfully slow. Every sound in the house seemed magnified, every shadow more menacing. It was around 4:30 a.m. when Detective Grant's phone buzzed again. He answered, speaking in low tones before hanging up and turning to us. "They've traced the call to a specific location. An old, abandoned warehouse off Route 17. We're mobilizing a team now." Relief mixed with dread in my gut as I processed his words. "So, what happens next?" "We're going in," he replied, his tone firm. "We have a team ready to storm the building, but we're hoping to negotiate first. We'll give them a chance to surrender. If they refuse, we take them down." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of hope and fear. This was it, the moment of truth. One way or another, this nightmare was about to end. But as much as I wanted to see it over, a part of me was bracing for the worst. "Mr. Jenkins, we'll need you to stay here," Grant said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is a dangerous operation, and we can't have civilians involved. Stay here and wait for the call." I clenched my fists, hating the idea of sitting on the sidelines, but I knew he was right. "Fine," I muttered, glancing at Liz. She looked just as terrified as I felt, though her fear only reminded me of her betrayal. The team left, their movements quick and efficient, leaving Liz and me in an agonizing silence. I could feel her eyes on me, but I refused to look at her. Every time I thought about her and Rick together, my blood boiled. And now, the thought of risking so much to save him, it was almost too much to bear. But as much as I wanted to walk away, to let my anger consume me, I knew I couldn't. Not while his life was hanging in the balance. Not while the outcome was still so uncertain. The minutes crept by, stretching painfully long, until finally, Detective Grant's number appeared on Liz's phone. She answered, putting it on speaker as he spoke. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with exhaustion. "We got them. Rick is safe, though he's a bit banged up. We'll be bringing him in for medical attention. You two should come down to the station." A strange mix of relief and resentment flooded me. Rick was safe, but at what cost? And now, with him out of harm's way, there were questions that needed answering. As Liz and I drove to the station, the silence between us was heavy, full of unspoken accusations and broken trust. Part of me wanted to confront Rick, to demand answers, while another part wanted to walk away and never look back. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The station was quiet when we arrived, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions storming inside me. Liz and I were led down a long corridor by a young officer who looked at us with pity, though she stayed silent. When we reached a small waiting room, Detective Grant was already there, looking exhausted but focused. "Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Jenkins," he greeted us with a nod. "Rick's being looked over by our medical team. He's bruised, but otherwise all right." I gave a stiff nod, keeping my jaw tight to hold back the wave of anger and resentment that surged up at the thought of my brother, safe and sound, after everything he'd put me through. But even now, a part of me needed to hear his side. What was he thinking? How could he betray me like this? Detective Grant sat down across from us, leaning forward with a serious expression. "We're going to bring Rick in soon, but I wanted to speak with both of you first." Liz shifted beside me, looking like she was bracing herself for an oncoming storm. I barely acknowledged her. Grant cleared his throat, his gaze intense. "It's my job to investigate every angle, and I have to ask, do either of you know why Rick might have been targeted by these people?" I frowned. "What do you mean? He's an insurance agent, not some big-shot businessman. Why would anyone want to kidnap him?" Grant's eyes flicked to Liz, who looked away, her face pale. Something about the way she couldn't meet his eyes made me feel uneasy. "There's a possibility this wasn't just a random attack," Grant said slowly. "We believe that Rick may have been involved in some risky activities." I felt a cold chill. "Risky? What are you saying?" Grant hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We have reason to believe that Rick may have gotten involved in illegal gambling. He has quite a bit of debt with some dangerous people who don't take kindly to unpaid debts. From what we've gathered, he was using various ways to keep his head above water, including borrowing money under the table from friends of yours." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own brother, sneaking around behind my back, stealing from people I trusted, getting tangled up with loan sharks and criminals. And now, thanks to his recklessness, I'd nearly paid the price. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, looking at Liz. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head, eyes wide with shock. "No, Matt, I swear. I had no idea. He never told me about any of this. He made it sound like he had everything under control." Her voice was trembling, and for once, I believed her. Even if she'd betrayed me with Rick, this seemed like news to her too. Before I could say anything else, the door opened, and an officer escorted Rick into the room. He looked rough, with a bruise on his cheek and a split lip, but he was alive. Seeing him standing there, looking guilty and beaten down, stirred up a storm of emotions I could barely control. Rick's eyes met mine for a brief second, but he quickly looked away. "Matt," he began, his voice low and full of shame. I'm so sorry. Sorry." I nearly laughed. "Sorry for what? For screwing around with my wife? Or for dragging me into whatever mess you got yourself mixed up in? Because right now, I don't even know where to start." He swallowed hard, glancing at Liz, then back at me. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I swear. Things just got out of hand." Out of hand. My voice rose, and I felt the rage bubbling up. "You mean lying to me, going behind my back, getting involved with people who would kill you, and maybe even me, over a few grand? That's not out of hand. Rick, that's reckless. How could you do this?" Rick's shoulders slumped, and he looked like he was fighting back tears. "I know, Matt. I know I messed up, but I was desperate. I owed these guys money. More than I could ever pay back on my own. They were threatening me, and I didn't know what else to do." Liz, who'd been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me, Rick? You had me thinking this was just a harmless fling. If I'd known, maybe I could have helped." Rick looked away, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't want to drag you into it, Liz. I thought I could handle it on my own. But when they found out I didn't have the money, they came for me. And when I couldn't pay, they decided to send a message." I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger, pity, and disgust. "So you lied to both of us, played with our lives, and for what? To keep your little secret safe." Rick's face crumpled, and he looked at me, his eyes full of regret. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Matt, not after what I did to you. But please, believe me when I say, I never meant for you to get involved. I never wanted any of this to happen." Detective Grant, who had been watching silently, finally stepped in. "Mr. Jenkins, regardless of what's happened, you're lucky to be alive. We're working on apprehending the people who did this, but I suggest you stay out of sight for the time being. These aren't people who forgive and forget." Rick nodded, looking defeated. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, if that's even possible." Liz turned to me, her face pleading. "Matt, I know I hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. But Rick, he's your brother. I think he really means it this time. He needs help." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. My wife, the woman I trusted most, had betrayed me. My brother, the person I'd shared my whole life with, had nearly gotten me killed. But standing here now, with both of them looking broken and defeated, I felt more exhausted than angry. Finally, I turned to Rick, my voice hollow. "You want to fix this? Then go away. Get out of town. Pay off your debts however you can, and don't come back until you've cleaned up your act. Because as far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me." Rick looked like he'd been slapped, but he nodded slowly, not arguing. "I understand. I'll go. I won't bother you again." Detective Grant stepped forward, nodding to the officers to escort Rick out. "We'll keep you updated on the situation," he said, his tone sympathetic. "In the meantime, I suggest you both take some time to figure things out." Rick gave me one last look, something like regret and gratitude flashing in his eyes, but I turned away. I couldn't bear to look at him any longer. As the officers led Rick out, I felt a strange, hollow relief. The nightmare was over, but at what cost? Liz stood beside me, waiting for me to say something, her eyes pleading. But I couldn't bring myself to look at her, to forgive her, or even to understand what she'd done. "Matt," she whispered, reaching out to touch my arm. "Please, just give me a chance to explain." I pulled away, feeling numb. "There's nothing to explain, Liz. You made your choice. Now I have to make mine." With that, I turned and walked out of the station, leaving her standing there, alone. The dawn was breaking over the town, casting a harsh light on everything I'd thought I knew. But now, in the cold morning air, all I felt was emptiness. The days after the police station felt like a fog. I kept my head down, barely slept, and went through the motions at the garage. I didn't want anyone's pity or questions, so I avoided everyone I knew. Willow Creek was a small town, but when you grew up somewhere, you learned how to keep to yourself when you had to. Liz moved out the same night we left the police station. She didn't say much, just packed a bag and left me standing alone in the doorway, watching her go. I didn't ask where she was headed, didn't care to know. We hadn't spoken a word since that last conversation in the station, and I intended to keep it that way. A few weeks passed, and I was slowly adjusting to life without her. I spent my evenings at the garage, working late to avoid going home. But then, on a quiet Tuesday, Detective Grant called, asking to meet. He had updates on Rick's case. I told him he could stop by the garage. Grant arrived just after 6, his face tired but serious. "We tracked down the group that kidnapped your brother," he said, leaning against the workbench. "They were part of a larger network we've been monitoring. Rick owed a lot of money. The kind of people who don't ask twice before coming after someone." I nodded, numb. "So it's over then?" "Mostly," Grant replied. "But there's something you should know. During our investigation, we found evidence that Rick had been skimming money from multiple clients and even some friends to pay his debts. He was forging documents and using insurance claims to make small payments here and there. It wasn't much at first, but it added up." "Are you telling me he's going to jail?" I asked, almost too exhausted to care. "We've given him the option to pay back what he owes or face charges. He's agreed to leave town and stay away, but he'll be monitored. As long as he stays clean and follows through, he should be able to avoid jail." I felt a bitter satisfaction at that. Rick, my own twin, had betrayed me, nearly cost me my life, and left a mess in his wake. The fact he'd be paying the price for it, even partially, was the closest thing to justice I was going to get. "What about Liz?" I asked finally, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Grant sighed. "There's no crime in what she did, at least not in the legal sense. I'll leave the rest up to you." He left shortly after, leaving me alone with a garage full of half-repaired cars and a mind full of unfinished thoughts. Rick had been given a chance, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. And Liz, there was a hollow feeling in my chest every time I thought about her. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under the garage door. It was from Liz, a neat envelope with my name written on it. For a moment, I thought about tossing it in the trash, but some part of me needed to know, needed to hear her side, even if it wouldn't change anything. I opened it, her handwriting familiar and strangely calming in a way I hated. "Dear Matt, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I only want you to understand. Rick and I started seeing each other at a time when I felt lost. You were so busy, so focused on everything but us. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. Rick told me things were under control, that his debts were manageable. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I didn't realize how deep he was in until it was too late. And when they came after him, when they threatened him, I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. I know that doesn't make things right, but I wanted you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I'm leaving Willow Creek. It's best for both of us, and you deserve someone better than me. I hope, in time, you can find it in yourself to move on. I'll always regret what I did, but I'll never regret the time I spent with you. I'm sorry, Matt." Liz. I set the letter down, feeling nothing. The anger was gone, burned out by the days of silence and the weeks of empty evenings. Maybe some part of me understood her reasons, but I couldn't forgive her. Not yet, and maybe not ever. Still, the next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of finality. Liz was gone, Rick was gone, and I was free from both of them. Maybe I'd been blind, trusting them both too easily, and maybe I'd been a fool to think family meant the same to them as it did to me. But at least now I knew where I stood. The weeks turned into months, and slowly I started to rebuild. The garage kept me busy, and little by little life went back to some version of normal. The people in town knew something had happened, but they didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for that. I was piecing myself back together, and the last thing I needed was more reminders of what had happened. But every now and then, late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about that letter, about the words Liz had written, the regret in every line. Maybe there was a part of her that really had loved me once. Or maybe that was just my own foolish heart, still trying to make sense of it all. Either way, it didn't matter now. I was done with both of them. The betrayal had cut deep, but I had survived it. And that was enough. Months passed, and I started to reclaim my life. The garage became more than just a job. It was my sanctuary. I poured my energy into it, stayed late working on old engines, taking in new clients, and filling my days so I'd have no time to dwell on everything I'd lost. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Willow Creek was the kind of town where secrets didn't stay hidden for long. I didn't know how much people knew about what had happened, but there were fewer pitying looks than I expected, fewer whispers when I walked by. For that, I was grateful. The last thing I wanted was anyone's sympathy. One Friday evening, as I was closing up the shop, I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Hey, Matt." I looked up and saw Sarah Evans, an old friend from high school, standing at the door. She was holding a set of car keys and giving me a hesitant smile. I heard you were the best mechanic in town." I chuckled, surprised by how good it felt to see a familiar face that didn't remind me of betrayal or loss. "If you believe the rumors, I guess that makes two of us." She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I've got a car that's been acting up, and I didn't know where else to go." "Bring it around," I said, gesturing to the garage. "I'll take a look." As I popped the hood and started inspecting her engine, Sarah leaned against the car, watching me. "It's good to see you, Matt. I always figured you'd stay in Willow Creek, but I never see you around." I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the car. "Been busy with the shop, and after everything, well, you know how it is." She nodded, her gaze soft. "Yeah, I heard a little. Just wanted you to know people here care about you. And if you ever need someone to talk to, or just to grab a drink, you know where to find me." Something in her voice made me look up. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment. Just understanding, the kind you don't see often. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. "Thanks, Sarah," I said, surprised by the sincerity in my own voice. "I might take you up on that." She left after I finished the repairs, and as I watched her drive off, I realized I felt lighter than I had in months. I didn't know if it was seeing an old friend or the fact that life was slowly moving forward, but for the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let go of the past. The next week, Sarah dropped by again, this time with coffee and donuts. "You looked like you could use a break," she said with a grin, handing me a coffee. We started talking, reminiscing about high school, laughing about old memories, and soon it became a weekly ritual. She'd swing by on her lunch break or after work, and little by little, I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble. Sarah didn't ask about Liz or Rick, didn't pry into the scars I was still carrying. She just showed up, and that was more than enough. One evening, after we'd closed up the garage, she asked me to join her for a drink. "Just friends," she said, her smile playful. But there was something in her eyes that told me she understood the weight of what she was offering. I agreed, surprised by how natural it felt. As we sat in the dim light of Willow Creek's only bar, nursing our drinks, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was at peace. We talked for hours, and when the conversation dipped into silence, it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, the kind of silence that only comes when you're around someone who sees you, scars and all. When she finally dropped me off at home that night, she looked at me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. "You're stronger than you think, Matt. And if you ever need a reminder, you know where to find me." I watched her drive away, feeling something shift inside me. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was something more. But for the first time, I knew that I'd be okay. The days turned into weeks, and I continued seeing Sarah, cautiously letting myself believe that I could rebuild. That maybe there was something worth holding on to after everything I'd been through. We kept things simple, never rushing, always careful. She became a part of my routine, a light in the middle of the chaos that had been my life. One day, as we were walking through the town square, she looked at me and asked, "Do you ever think about leaving Willow Creek?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "I used to think this place was all I'd ever need. But after everything, I don't know if it feels like home anymore." She nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes, staying means facing the past, but leaving, that could mean a fresh start." "You deserve that, Matt." Her words struck a chord. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to put Willow Creek behind me, to leave the ghosts and memories in the rearview mirror. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I felt like I had options. I could start over, find a new place, a new life, maybe even a new love. As we walked through town that day, I felt a strange sense of possibility. The pain and betrayal still lingered, but they didn't define me anymore. And with Sarah by my side, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could build something new. By spring, I'd made my decision. Leaving Willow Creek felt surreal, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was the right choice. This town had given me a life, a home, and memories both good and bad. But it was time to leave it behind, to find out who I could be away from the shadows of my past. Sarah was supportive from the start, offering to help me with the garage sale, the packing, everything. And though we hadn't talked about what this meant for us, she was always there, showing up like she always did, steady and unflinching. On my last day in Willow Creek, we stood together outside the garage. I'd sold it to a local family, a young couple who seemed eager to make it their own. I handed them the keys that morning, and for a moment, I felt a pang of loss. This place had been my world for so long, and now I was letting it go. But I knew I couldn't hold on forever. As the sun started to set, Sarah and I walked down to the lake where we used to hang out in high school, just to take in the view one last time. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink of the sky, and a quiet settled over us. After a long moment, she looked over at me, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "So, where are you headed first?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Not sure yet," I said, looking out over the water. "Somewhere new, somewhere I can start fresh." She nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. "I get that. Sometimes, a clean slate is what we need most." We stood there in comfortable silence, the weight of everything unspoken settling between us. I felt a strange ache in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear, as I thought about what lay ahead. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew what I was leaving behind. Years of betrayal, pain, and broken trust. And somehow, letting it all go felt freeing. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was soft. "You know, if you need company on the road, I'm not exactly tied down to this place either." The offer hung in the air, and I felt a warmth spread through me. I hadn't wanted to ask, hadn't wanted to assume, but hearing her say it out loud made my heart race in a way it hadn't in a long time. "You sure about that?" I asked, half smiling. "This is a one-way trip. No turning back." She looked at me, her eyes steady, her expression serious. "Yeah, Matt, I'm sure." We left Willow Creek the next morning, packed into my old truck with nothing but a few bags and the open road ahead of us. The town faded in the rearview mirror, but the weight of everything I was leaving behind didn't feel heavy. It felt like a relief. As we drove, I felt the familiar surge of anticipation, the thrill of the unknown. Sarah sat beside me, humming softly along to the radio, her presence a quiet reassurance. We didn't talk much, didn't need to. The road stretched out ahead, each mile carrying us further from the past and closer to whatever lay ahead. In the end, it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, the chance to start over with someone who'd seen me at my worst and hadn't walked away. And as the miles passed, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd found what I'd been looking for all along. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it was still there, somewhere deep down. But it was a part of who I was, not all of me. And with Sarah by my side, I was ready to move forward, 1 mile at a time. For the first time in what felt like forever, I looked toward the horizon with hope.